historical research firm Prologue DC, and the digital public history project, Mapping Segregation in Washington, DC. I'd also like to plug a few of my recent projects, and because they're up now and you can visit them. I worked on the Food for the People exhibition currently at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, and also collaborated on National Underground Network to Freedom signage recently installed at Walter Pierce Park in Adams Morgan near the Duke Ellington Bridge end of the park, and on a brand new sign that just went in last week commemorating the 16th Street World War I tree memorial, and it's at 16th and Alaska Northwest. Our presentation today will chronicle demographic change in two Northwest DC neighborhoods as restrictive covenants fell and many white residents left the city. We'll examine the real estate industry's role in white flight and debunk the myth that the arrival of Black residents brought decline. And I'll start by providing some context. Then we'll have Tanya Golash-Boza speaking via video on Brightwood Park. And then after that, we'll have Phylicia Fauntleroy Bowman on North Portal Estates, and I'll introduce them right before their turn to speak. And after that, we'll have time for questions and discussion. Since Tanya will be on video, we have her grad student, Mark, undergraduate student, Mark Rivas, to answer questions and join in the discussion. Washington's old city was largely built up by 1890, so real estate developers began looking north to the rural area beyond the former city boundary, Florida Avenue. This 1891 map shows streetlights, and you can see that they're fairly dense in Northwest DC south of Florida Avenue. Going north, a number of streets are laid out north of Florida Avenue, for example, in Columbia Heights and Bloomingdale. As these neighborhoods also filled with row houses, development moved to the district's northernmost section, what is now Ward 4. I've marked its southern boundary, Spring Road and Rock Creek Church Road. The streetlights sort of peter out once you get to the Ward 4 area. Some of Petworth has been laid out, but the northern part of the city was not even included on this map because it hadn't started to develop in 1891. That happened over the next few decades. Brightwood Park, mostly in the 1920s and 1930s, and North Portal Estates starting in the 1930s. Developers had enormous power to shape the district's physical landscape. This 1931 deed covers lots on the unit block of Kennedy Street Northwest in Brightwood Park. It included covenants prohibiting any kind of liquor production or sales, and other covenants requiring houses to cost at least $3,000 to build. Houses also had to be detached, that is, no row houses. Besides deciding how the physical landscape would look, that developers also had the power to define the racial landscape through covenants that excluded African Americans. Racial covenants were used in the district as early as 1854, but they became more popular in the early 1900s, not just here, but all over the country. This one says, quote, "No part of said property shall ever be sold or rented to a person or persons of African descent," end quote. Below the racial covenant are restrictions on various uses, including manufacturing shops, stables, slaughterhouses, theaters, and circuses. This next deed is for 1655 North Portal Drive in North Portal Estates. This one is also from 1931, and it also contains a number of restrictions: residential only, but no apartments, detached houses only. And they had to be more than 1 story high and cost at least $20,000 to build, almost 7 times the requirement for Brightwood Park. This racial covenant in that same deed is broader. It banned not only African Americans, but also, quote, Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, and Syrians, end quote. It allowed servants from any of those groups, though. This map shows where we've found racially restrictive covenants in Ward 4, both east of Rock Creek Park and also west. Individually restricted lots are dark gray. And in some cases, we found that developers had restricted whole subdivisions, sometimes before they'd even built anything. And we marked those areas in blue. This map does not show every covenant that ever existed because lot numbers have sometimes changed, and that made mapping old lots sometimes difficult. Also, the city has digitized property records only starting in August 1921, and researching deeds from before August 1921 is done in the DC archives in the hard copy records, and that's really time consuming, so we haven't done a lot of it. But the two neighborhoods we're looking at today were built mostly after 1921. Courts upheld restrictive covenants or racially restrictive covenants until 1948. Some of the northernmost parts of the district developed after 1948 and never had racial covenants. This is a close-up on Brightwood Park. Some of it was originally part of the 1908 Chilham Castle Heights subdivision, which was restricted for whites only, or to whites only. It was allowed, only whites were allowed to move there. The block with the pop-up had the racial covenant that I showed you before. This map shows North Portal Estates and surrounding neighborhoods. The arrow points to the block with the second racial covenant I showed you. A few years ago, I researched early African-American communities in Ward 4, and one of them was here on the Maryland line. I've circled a covenant on a property that once belonged to Henry Brown. Brown bought this property about 1880 and became a part of a tiny African-American enclave called the Pines, actually straddled the district line, and it had formed before Rock Creek Park existed. He was a widower in 1926 when he sold his land to Edson Briggs, a white developer you'll be hearing more about. All but one of the Black owners in the Pines had sold their land by 1940. This last series of maps shows changing Ward 4 demographics. This is 1940, and you can see there are few Black residents remaining. The darker the color, the greater the percentage of African Americans on a block. There were still a handful of Black families around Fort Stevens in 1950, but basically Ward 4 was all white by then. However, the US Supreme Court had ruled racially restrictive covenants unenforceable in 1948, so the demographics were about to change. By 1960, African Americans had moved on to many blocks of Ward 4 up to Walter Reed Army Medical Center. This is 1970 when the Black population of DC was at its height at 71%. The area east of Rock Creek Park had become mostly African American, and the area west of Rock Creek Park remained almost all white. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and introduce the next speaker. And since she's not here with us in person, here's a picture of her. Tanya Golash-Boza, PhD, is a native Washingtonian who attended DC public schools. She is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced, and the founder of its Racism, Capitalism, and the Law Lab. A prolific author, she has received several awards, including the Distinguished Contribution to Research Book Award from the American Sociological Association for her 2015 book, Deported: Immigrant Policing, Disposable Labor, and Global Capitalism, from New York University Press. Her textbook, Race and Racisms, A Critical Approach, from Oxford University Press, is the leading textbook in this field. Since some of our research interests coincide, my mapping segregation colleague, Sarah Schoenfeld, and I have been collaborating and exchanging ideas with Dr. Golash-Boza for a few years now.
Good afternoon. I regret that I'm not able to be with you there physically, but I really look forward to engaging with you on this work in progress virtually. So in the late 19th century, real estate developers began a decades-long process of transforming the Petworth neighborhood in Washington, D.C. from a sparsely populated rural area into a densely populated urban neighborhood. Petworth was designed to appeal to working and middle-class white families who wanted to live outside the central city. These developers put racially restrictive covenants in the deeds into these homes to prevent their sale or rental to Black families. By the 1920s, the real estate industry had created a densely populated all-white neighborhood 3 miles north of the White House. Brightwood Park was part of the Petworth neighborhood assessment area. When I speak about Petworth, I'm referring to an agglomeration of 6 census tracts with about 25,000 residents, pictured above on the right. When I draw from census data to explain trends over time, it's useful to have this larger sample. When I speak about Brightwood Park, I'm referring to one of the Petworth census tracts, tract 2102, in the 2010 census. It's an area with about 4,000 residents. We use this smaller tract for more fine-grained analysis as it's more manageable. The maps above show the locations of Brightwood Park and Petworth, and also that they were both all white in 1950. By 1950, Petworth had over 30,000 residents and was 97% white. By 1970, Petworth was 94% Black. Today's presentation will consider the role of real estate speculators in Petworth's transition from white to Black between 1950 and 1970. Black people began to move into Petworth after 2 key Supreme Court decisions. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable. And in 1954, the Supreme Court ordered schools to desegregate. Anyone familiar with US urban history during this time period would not find this rapid racial transition surprising. This was the era of white flight, when white urban residents fled central cities for the newly built suburbs. The white population of the District of Columbia decreased by 1/3, while the suburbs' white population increased 91%. To paraphrase a popular sentiment, DC became Chocolate City and its suburbs became vanilla. White flight opened up home ownership opportunities for Black families during a time when Black people's economic prospects were improving. Between 1940 and 1970, Black people's annual average wages tripled. The Black home ownership rate also nearly doubled between 1940 and 1970, from 22.8% to 41.6%. Whereas only 1 in 5 Black people lived in homes they owned in 1940, by 1950, 1 in 3 did. And by 1970, over 40% of Black people lived in homes they owned. Notably, there was a greater percentage increase in Black home ownership than white home ownership each decade between 1940 and 1970. In Washington, D.C., there was a 6-fold increase in the number of Black homeowners, from 7,616 to 44,758 between 1940 and 1970. By 1980, there were over 50,000 Black homeowners in DC. By 1970, Washington, D.C. had one of the most prosperous Black communities in the country. Notably, Detroit and D.C. were the only 2 cities in the US where 40% of Black families earned over $10,000 a year. That's about $75,000 in today's dollars. Now, is this increase in Black home ownership a story of racial uplift or a story of white profiteering? In Washington, D.C. and across the country, real estate agents engage in blockbusting, which Kevin Gotham defines as a practice in which a real estate agent attempts to move a Black family into an all-white neighborhood for the purpose of exploiting white fears of impending racial turnover and property devaluation in order to buy up other property on the block at depressed prices. Studies of the real estate industry have found this pattern of white profiteering in Kansas City, Baltimore, New York City, and Chicago. However, there have been relatively few studies that systematically consider the effect blockbusters had. Now, the story of racial change in Petworth has at least two angles. On the one hand, over 5,000 Black people gained access to home ownership in Petworth during a time when there were multiple barriers to home ownership. On the other hand, real estate agents and speculators profited from the rapid turnover the neighborhood experienced. Is the rise of Black homeownership in Petworth a story of racial uplift, or is it a story of white profiteering? And could it be both? There's some evidence that blockbusting occurred in Petworth, but there's also evidence to the contrary. For example, when Dr. Hinton's children recounted their experience of being the first Black homebuyer on their block in 1953 to my collaborators at Prologue DC, they described their real estate agent as an ally who helped break down racial barriers. Dr. Clinton purchased a home at 13th and Farragut Streets Northwest in 1953. As the first Black homebuyer on his block, he knew he'd face resistance, so he found a white person to negotiate the sale on his behalf. When his neighbors learned a Black person was moving in, they put padlocks on his doors. Dr. Hinton cut the padlocks off and spent the first nights in his home with his real estate broker to ensure his family was not in danger. When nothing terrible happened, Dr. Hinton moved his family into the home. Within a generation, their block became all Black. This is the story Dr. Hinton's children recounted to the historians at Prologue DC. The property records reveal a more complicated story. The white owner, Joseph Suit, sold the home to Francis Stovall on February 20th, 1953 for $20,000. 7 days later, Francis Stovall sold the home to Dr. Hinton for $7,500. In 1972, Stovall and Hinton signed releases indicating they had paid off their loans. Francis Stovall's name appears in hundreds of similar transactions in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s. Was she a blockbuster or an ally? According to Dr. Hinton's children, Stovall was a straw buyer and an ally who helped them buy their home. However, it's clear that profiteering was also common. We know for certain that blockbusting happened in Petworth. The Neighbors Inc. archive held at the Martin Luther King Library contains multiple instances of blockbusting, including these cards pictured here that realtors sent to homeowners to get them to sell their homes. Nevertheless, it's still not clear just how common blockbusting was. So our research project explores the prevalence of blockbusting through a systematic and comprehensive analysis of one census tract in Petworth. In the 2010 census, this tract is known as Tract 2102, and the name of the subdivision is Brightwood Park. My research team first collected data on every home sale in Brightwood Park between 1922, when the subdivision was first built, and 1970, by which time the subdivision had become nearly all Black. Research assistants filled out a 12-point questionnaire on each lot, which contains detailed information about each home sale. We collected data on the 30 squares in the census tract, yielding an analysis of 1,830 lots. Census block data shows that Brightwood Park underwent a rapid racial transition between 1950 and 1970, turning from 99% white to nearly all Black in less than a generation. It's important to note that the main thing that changed about this neighborhood is the race of the residents. Other socioeconomic indicators remained the same. The neighborhood transitioned from white, working to middle class, to Black, working to middle class. The home sales data also allow for a more granular analysis than the census block data, as we can see the changes from one year to the next. We found that 1/3 of the lots in Brightwood Park between 1948 and 1970 were sold with the help of a middle person like Francis Stovall. This middle person would purchase the home from one family and resell it to another, sometimes for a profit and sometimes not. If all the sales were for profit, we could say with clarity that these middle people were speculators, but that's not the case. Sometimes middle persons bought and sold the home for the exact same price and sometimes for a loss. The figure above shows each home that had a middle person involved in the sale. This provides some evidence of blockbusting, as some of the sales with middle people are concentrated on certain blocks. These data also allowed us to see that a small set of names appeared and reappeared in the sales. We thus made a list of each middle person that appeared in more than 4 times in that role. And we're conducting further research on each of these individuals to determine if they were real estate speculators. We also cross-checked this list with Neighbors Inc.'s list of real estate speculators and found some overlap. For example, George Basilico is a known speculator, and he was involved in home sales in Brightwood Park. We also can look at home sale patterns in one block to evaluate the extent to which blockbusting occurred. Today, we're going to look at block 3395, bounded by Jefferson and Ingraham Streets and 1st and 2nd Streets. This block is made up of row homes on all 4 sides. Census block data tell us that in 1950, this block was 87% owner occupied and all of the residents were white. By 1960, the block was 90% owner occupied and 81% black. By 1970, of the 57 homes on this block, only 5 white owner occupiers remained, as compared to 47 black owner occupiers. Nearly all the white families on this block sold their homes to black families. The real estate speculators play a role in that, and did they profit? Of the 57 lots on this block, 21 were bought and resold in less than 6 months. There was a flurry of quick resales in 1954 and 1955. Remember, schools desegregated in 1954. In the 10 years between 1950 and 1960, nearly all the white homeowners on this block sold their homes. In 1948 and 1949, in each year, 1 person sold their home. In 1950, there were 3 home sales. In 1951, there was 1 sale. In 1952, there were 2 home sales. And then there were 4 home sales in 1953. So there's a consistent pattern of 1 to 4 home sales a year until 1954, when the home sales began to pick up. In both 1954 and 1955, there were 16 home sales on this block, all by people who had lived there prior to 1948 and thus who were white. This pattern provides some evidence of blockbusting, as the home sales happen in rapid succession on this one block. Blockbusting, however, requires the active participation of realtors. The home sales data can also tell us something about this. There are 57 lots on block 3395. 21 of these lots were bought and resold in less than 6 months between 1948 and 1971. Each of these sales had a middle person. For example, on June 26, 1959, the Orem Lands sold their home to the Sindler Realtor Company for $13,454. That same day, the Sindler Realtor Company sold the home to the Colberts for $17,000. This is an example of the Sindlers profiting from a sale. Our analysis showed that the Sindlers profited from many home sales in Brightwood Park and across the city. However, on this same block, there's a case where the Sindlers bought a home and then sold it 15 days later for less than they purchased it for. This is also a consistent pattern in our data, where homes are sometimes sold for less than the original purchase price, even by known speculators. So this is something we're going to continue to parse out. In sum, our research shows that homes in Brightwood Park were sold in rapid succession immediately following the order to desegregate schools. Some of these home sales involved known speculators. Other home sales were facilitated by people who are helping Black people buy homes from white property owners. And we need to do further research to understand these patterns better. Today, Brightwood Park is undergoing a new set of racial transitions. After increasing steadily in the 1950s and 60s, today, the Black population in Petworth and in Brightwood Park is steadily declining. The decline of Black residents in Brightwood Park and Petworth today is also being facilitated by speculators. According to a report from Redfin, the average gain of a home flip in Petworth was $337,000 in 2016, higher than any other neighborhood in the US. Other DC neighborhoods that fared well in this measure include Brooklyn and Brightwood. Petworth, Brightwood, and Brooklyn are among the top 10 hottest neighborhoods in the country for speculators. Both then and now, speculation has consequences for Black home ownership. In 1970, Petworth was a majority Black community, with half of Black families living in homes they owned. Today, the neighborhood is only 50% Black, and there are only 3,000 Black homeowners. The Hintons, mentioned earlier, purchased their home in 1953 for about $20,000. They lived in the neighborhood for 45 years before selling their family selling their family home in 1998 for $230,000, making for a very small profit on a 45-year investment when we take inflation into account. The people who bought the home from them sold it in 2019 for $700,000, a fair profit on a 20-year investment. But 5 months later, the remodeled home sold for $1.3 million, a considerable profit for these speculators. These speculators made more money on the Hinton home in less than 6 months than the Hintons did in 45 years. Housing is a commodity, but not everybody who buys a home makes a profit. Although thousands of Black people purchased homes in Petworth in the 1950s and 1960s, most would not see a return on this investment for decades. The median home value in Petworth barely increased between 1950 and 2000. This means that investing in a home in Petworth after the neighborhood became majority Black would not lead to increased wealth for homeowners. The rise in home value in Petworth began in the 2000s, corresponding with the arrival of white residents in the neighborhood and a decline in the number of Black homeowners. Speculators profited from racial transitions in neighborhoods in the mid-20th century and continue to profit today. Our research shows that speculation did happen, but we need to do more research to fully understand its impacts. Our research also drives home the point that speculators can profit from housing because it is a commodity. As the United States has moved away from public housing and left nearly all housing solutions to the private market, we've created a situation where one of the most fundamental human rights, the right to shelter, has been left to market forces. At the same time, we've created a racialized economic system where, to the extent that middle-class people have any wealth at all, most of that wealth lies in the value of their home. Yet the simple fact of a home, and particularly a neighborhood, being occupied by Black people decreases the value of that home. Speculators profiting from home sales while Black people are being displaced from DC is not a bug in the system of racial capitalism, but a feature. So this is very much a work in progress, and we look forward to your questions, and here are our next steps. So we're going to continue research on middle persons to learn more about them. We're going to continue to track home sales and home sale values to understand if middle persons profited from the sales. And we're also going to create a public-facing story map and interactive data visualizations with the data that we've collected. Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Tanya. And sorry to everyone about that long delay. We still have time for everything though. Phylicia Fauntleroy Bowman is the next speaker. And Phylicia Fauntleroy Bowman, PhD, is a native Washingtonian and an economist who retired in 2015 after almost 31 years of the DC Public Service Commission, 25 of those years as executive director. She and her family were among the first Black residents on their block of Petworth in Ward 4 in early 1954. She was attending a segregated DC public school at the time and remembers the day, the following October, that the schools desegregated and she suddenly had to switch schools. A graduate of Ward 4's Roosevelt High School, she subsequently earned degrees from Oberlin College and American University. Dr. Bowman and I first got to know each other in 2012 when we started working together on a centennial history of the DC Public Service Commission. That book came out in 2016, and by then the project had turned Dr. Bowman into a historian. Today, she is spearheading an effort to document the history of her neighborhood, North Portal Estates.
Let's see which glasses I need to use. Good afternoon. The title, From Exclusion to Inclusion. This deals with North Portal Estates, today a community of 222 houses lying in the northernmost point of DC, between 16th Street and Rock Creek Park.
Use the microphone, please. Oh, okay.
A central theme is how North Portal Estate's changing demographic profile and external events have contributed to housing market prices and real estate property values in the community. Of particular note is what happened to home sale prices and property values after Blacks moved into the neighborhood in the 1960s that challenges the widely held belief that after Blacks move in, housing prices and property values fall. In 1926, Edson W. Briggs Jr. bought 100 acres of wooded land that had been part of the Fenwick slave-owning plantation. Briggs called it Rock Creek Park Estates. The word estates reflected the unusually large size of the building sites. And during the Fenwick period, about 20 to 30 slaves lived and worked on the land, and they were emancipated in 1862. Edson's vision was to create an exclusive high-end community in Rock Creek Park Estates where only dwellings would be built that were architecturally representative of the period of the 13 colonies, where expected price range of the homes would be $35,000 to $95,000, and where racially restrictive covenants would maintain the value of the houses. And this is from Mara's map, Briggs, showing Briggs restricted covenants in what is now called Colonial Village, which is north of Kalmia Road and parts of what we now call North Portal Estates. There were two types of racially restrictive covenants. In the case of the North Portal area, the brown area were the deeds in 1928 to 1930, and they excluded Negroes only. And that accounted for about a third of the 45 lots. However, 2/3 of the lots, which are shown in yellow, excluded Negroes, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, Armenians, and Syrians. The first house built in North Portal area was 1731 North Portal Drive, now 1765 North Portal Drive. And this is a picture of the house from the newspaper at the time. 3 houses were built as of the end of 1929, and they were all owned by Gentiles. I have to use Gentiles to differentiate them from Jewish owners. By 1939, 10 years later, only 10 houses had been built. And there were 2 Jewish owners, and you can see there in blue, and they bought houses on lots that excluded only Negroes and not Jews. And one of them was Gus Bleckman, who owned Bleckman's Fashion Shop at 7th and 8th Streets Northeast. And some of you may also know it as McBride's. During this period, very few homes were actually built, and many of the lots were not sold. And that's due to the stock market crash and the Great Depression. I don't have prices for that period, but building permits show the cost of constructing a house declined substantially from $25,000 in 1930 to $15,000 by 1941, and property values fell. By 1949, there were 19 houses. 9 had been built over the decade of the 40s, and 4 of those 9 had been built after the Supreme Court decision. There was also one Lebanese family and an interracial family that included one Gentile, and the wife was Lebanese. And Lebanon had been part of Syria, so that was part of the excluded group. The households during that period, 28 to 1949, the Gentiles were principally professionals, and many were DC natives. Among the Jewish and Lebanese, they were principally small business owners and immigrants. Real estate was an occupation common to many. Most had moved to the area from elsewhere in Northwest DC, and most had died or moved from the area by the end of the 1950s, so they were not part of white flight. After the 1948 Supreme Court decision, 13 lots were purchased by a Jewish-owned company called Friedfeld, and that company's name came from the last names of the two owners, Fried for Friedman and Sittenfeld for the Feld. Their wives were sisters, and their father owned a lumber company. All of the 13 lots had previously excluded Jewish owners, and Friedfeld built 4 houses by the end of 1949 and 9 more houses by the end of 1953, all to be owned by Jewish families. In late 1952, Leo Bernstein, a real estate mogul, purchased for $750,000 about 660 acres of wooded land west of 16th Street above North Portal Drive. He formed a new company, Redwood Terrace Estates, for the sole purpose of developing the area north of Redwood Terrace to the DC line, and he called it Redwood Terrace Estates. However, the first advertisements called the area North Portal Estates, and that's the name, remains the name today. During the 1950s, Leo Bernstein left the operation of his North Portal real estate business to others whom he had previously trained while he pursued other ventures. And this is a picture of him. He never lived in North Portal, but his second wife did before they married in 1971. By 1959, there were 137 houses in the neighborhood, 109 of which were built on land that Leo Bernstein had purchased. And so I call him the father of North Portal Estates. And you can see the light green squares are the houses that were built. The houses, contrary to the earlier ones, which were colonials, these houses were modern for the time. They were ramblers and split level homes, and these are 2 ads for them. There were 131 new households that purchased in the 50s. Many were Jewish residents who were first or second generation Russian or Eastern European immigrants. And some of the Gentile immigrants were from Southern Europe, such as Spain, Italy, and Greece. Most residents moved to North Portal from within DC and especially Northwest, where Blacks were buying houses in the 1950s. So they were actually part of the white flight during the 1950s. The median age when houses were purchased they were in their 40s. Nearly half of the Jewish heads of households were very successful and some wealthy small business owners, nearly half of whom were in the food and beverage business. Many got help from small business administration loans. The second place were professionals, doctors, lawyers, more doctors than lawyers, and real estate. Most of the Gentile and Lebanese men were in real estate or were small business owners. One of the Lebanese owners owned Kojak's liquor store, which you may be familiar with. Relatively few of the wives were employed outside of the home, although some helped at the husband's businesses, while many devoted their time to charitable organizations. And most residents knew Leo Bernstein either professionally or socially. By 1959, the neighborhood was 83% Jewish, 13% Gentile. A number of changes occurred in the 1960s that had an immediate impact on North Portal. After 2 years of opposition by Neighbors, Inc. and the American Veterans Committee and Americans for Democratic Action in August 1960, newspapers such as the Washington Post and Evening Star stopped the practice of having separate ads for coloreds. Also in 1960, the DC government reduced the residential assessment ratio substantially, which reduced property taxes. In 1960-61, the State Department sought housing for Africans from newly emerging countries and for Negro diplomats. In 1961, President Kennedy appointed John Duncan as the first Black commissioner. In 1964, DC passed a new fair housing law. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson changed the leadership structure of the DC government from 3 commissioners to an appointed mayor, and the new mayor was Walter Washington, who is Black. And unlike Jews and Gentiles, Blacks were precluded from moving to the suburbs during most of the 50s and much of the 60s. Montgomery County had, which had been a history of restrictive covenants, did not pass a fair housing law until 1968. And these are ads. One of the interesting things about North Portal is that the ads for coloreds in Northwest usually was right next to or right after the North Portal ads. So Blacks looking for housing in Northwest would have easily seen what was available in North Portal. And people like Bernstein were advertising in the colored sections for housing in Shepherd Park and in Crestwood, but none in North Portal. Nearly 100 years after Blacks on the Fenwick plantation were emancipated, in late 1961, the first Black resident bought a house, Dr. Ross and Alice Johnson. He was a Foreign Service officer coming back from an overseas assignment. And I think he was able to move in because of the State Department pressure to locate Negro diplomats in North Portal. The second family were Robert and Sadie Harlan. Robert Jackson is his middle name. His family was owned by the Supreme Court families of the Supreme Court justices with the same name. And he had written to President Kennedy, the newspapers, the DC commissioners, saying he wanted to break up small white neighborhoods. He looked at Chevy Chase, but ended up choosing North Portal. Based on data for 2/3 of the 254 Black residents in 1960, about half had some affiliation with Howard University. The 92% had at least an undergraduate degree and 42% had advanced degrees. Noteworthy, there were 5 Black orthopedic surgeons in the United States and 3 lived in North Portal estates. Many were educators, many wives who had college degrees were employed outside of the home in professional level occupations. Many knew each other professionally and socially, including through sororities, fraternities, and churches. Most previously owned a house and moved from within Northwest DC. And most bought existing houses from Jewish residents rather than the new houses that had been built. There were also Black buyers who were investors who built and sold houses. There were 6 Black buyers who bought lots and custom built their own houses. There were 1 Black church, the United House of Prayer, right near us now, bought a large house, which is they still own it, and it's well known in the area. And 6 emerging African nations bought houses. There were non-Blacks who moved into the neighborhood in the 60s. 44 households were Jewish, 14 Gentiles, and 1 each Lebanese, Asian, and Hispanic. But the truth is, most of those who moved into North Portal in the 50s and a substantial number that moved into North Portal in the 60s left. They sold. And most sellers were Jewish, since most of the residents were Jewish, and most of the sellers moved to the Maryland suburbs, where those with real estate ties had been involved in the construction of houses, commercial office spaces, and shopping malls. So there was a push, but there was also a pull. However, not everyone sold. 42 of the households did not sell and stayed. And we now have the longest living resident in the neighborhood is in this group. In addition, there were some non-Black residents who moved into North Portal after 61 because they wanted an integrated neighborhood. And namely, many of us know, John Koskinen, former city administrator. He and his wife were steered by the realtors to west of the park, and he came to DC to work on the Kerner Commission report, and he indicated he wanted to live in an integrated neighborhood. Not only that, but he and Dr. Robert Barr wrote amendments to their covenants opposing restrictive covenants. By 1969, then 125, first of all, 68 new houses had been built, bringing the total to 205. And of those 205 houses, 61% were Black owned. So it went from 0 Blacks in 1960 to 61% in 1969. The neighborhood actually became majority Black around 1967. And there were nearly 30% Jewish and a handful of the others. Between 1970 and 2019, Blacks' demand for houses in North Portal continued to be strong as an upper middle class, predominantly Black neighborhood. As demand for housing by non-Blacks fell to almost nothing, Black share of houses continued to rise, peaking at 91% in 2009. The neighborhood continued to be a mecca for well-educated and successful Blacks, such that it became known as the Platinum Coast, since some of them had come from Crestwood that was already known as the Gold Coast. Looking out over the entire period, 1928 to 2021, you can see very low number of sales in before 1950. Then you see the big bulge with the construction of new houses and the white flight. And then you see a pretty stable number of sales for the remainder. By 1979, the Black share of the neighborhood rose to 75%. Blacks are represented by purple. And the Jewish percentage went down to 16%. To 2009, the neighborhood was 91% Black, and there were only 7 houses owned by Jews and 7 by Gentiles. Between 2009 and 2019, the Black share went down to 80%. So there was a drop of 11 percentage points, but still a very predominantly Black neighborhood. But you start to see a rise in the other ethnic groups. What are some of the factors contributing to those changes over the last few years? And one is the aging of the houses, most of which were built in the 50s and early 60s. And so by then, the houses were ready for updating. The Rambler split level type housing has also enabled aging residents to remain in their houses longer. The aging of the residents is another major factor. And as such, prices have risen as developers have bought houses, often from estates or aging residents at $700,000, $800,000, renovated the houses and resold them for $1 million or more. By 2020, 1/4 of the North Portal estate houses were assessed at over $1 million. Did North Portal estate housing practice, however, fall after Blacks moved into the neighborhood in the 1960s? And the simple answer is no. And I conducted several analyses to address that question. First, I looked at the prices, housing prices in the 1950s, particularly from 1954 to 1961. And thanks to Derek Gray for compiling the data for this during COVID when I didn't have access to it myself. And you see that the prices at 54, 55, we have school desegregation, and you start to see the number, the average prices fall. But when Blacks started moving in, look what happens. The prices go up substantially, ranging primarily between $50,000 and $60,000. And that was a lot of money for the time. The average household income is about $6,500, and this was twice the average value of homes in DC. How could these new Black residents afford to pay the higher prices? Well, most had already previously bought a house in DC. They had established good credit. I did do an analysis of their financing and found they used many of the same lenders that the buyers in the 50s used at the same interest rates. Most of the Black male buyers had military service that enabled them to take advantage of the GI Bill, both for educational purposes and for housing. I looked at housing asking prices and in the 50s and the 60s by type of house, and that showed too an increase. I looked at the aggregated annual assessed value of North Portal houses, and you can see that started going up around the 1960s. The average annual North Portal States house sale prices also, you see the increase starting from the 60s and continuing up. The dip up here is due to the recession. And in constant dollars, there's still an upward trend. I also conducted a regression analysis to correlate the Black share of households with and mortgage interest rates with the prices. And that showed a positive correlation between the Black share and prices. In other words, as the Black share increased, prices increased. I also compared the value of homes. This is census data, mostly census data in North Portal with Census Tract 16, which includes North Portal, Colonial Village, and Shepherd Park, and DC, and the prices have generally been in North Portal higher than in those other two areas. Is North Portal unique? I'm not convinced that it is. I think if similar analyses were done at other neighborhoods in DC, you might get the same results. Moreover, as I've talked with friends in other cities, they tell me they think there are similar examples. I posit that housing prices and values do not decline with white flight, but when upper and middle class Blacks leave and houses start to be rented out and neighborhoods start to decline. This study does not address whether there is racial bias in North Portal estate prices. That requires a comparison of the prices with other neighborhoods, such as Hawthorne, which has similar housing types, houses built about the same vintage, same period of time, but it's west of the park. So and I encourage researchers or people looking for dissertations to take that on. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now have questions. We've got not very much time. Yes. Yes.
I wanted to write down what exactly was a speculator.
Oh.
Yes, so a speculator, it represents a middle person. And so this represents an investor or a real estate broker that was flipping homes.
We call them flippers now.
Oh, okay.
I don't know why speculator went away. It's a useful term. Yes.
On that same note, in the second presentation, is there any evidence of that same sort of speculation and house flipping to facilitate a transition to more Black ownership in North Portal estates?
Well, their developers have been, as I mentioned, have been busy in the last decade or so. However, there's many of those homes after renovation have been bought by Blacks. In 2021, 13 houses sold and 9 were bought by Blacks, and they bought the most expensive homes. So there's still a strong demand for housing in North Portal, and I'm sure some other neighborhoods by Blacks. But yes, there are others who are also interested. The first house that I showed you that was built in North Portal just sold in January of this year for two plus million. It sold for 300,000 over asking price.
One thing about speculators is that they want to make money, of course, that's the point of it. And so if North Portal is a more expensive neighborhood in the first place, so they can't make as much money because the market won't allow the kind of profit they could see by buying houses. I live in Petworth, and a lot of the houses on the other side of the street from my side of the street is like 1,150 square feet. And you can't really pop them up. But on the other side, they're 4 stories. They're much bigger. They're, I don't know, 4,000 square feet or something like that. They're buying, people have flipped a lot of them already because they can make 2, they were buying them a while back for 400,000, turning them into 2 condos and selling each one for 700,000 or something like that. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of, considering the quality of work or lack of quality of work they do. They make a lot of money.
And in North Portal, the developers some are Black, some are Asian. There was a company called MAD, Mothers and Daughters. It was Chinese owned. And they renovated an aging house and sold it and turned it around rather quickly. But again, Blacks bought a lot of those houses. Not all, though.
I've just been informed that was the last question.